The story of Abraham is one of extraordinary faith, divine promises, and unimaginable tests. A man born in a prosperous city in Mesopotamia, surrounded by the richness of life, is called to leave everything behind. A voice not heard with ears but felt deeply within his heart beckons him toward a future he cannot yet see. Leave your homeland and your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. This simple but powerful command ignites a journey that will span generations and lay the foundation for one of the world's most influential legacies. Abraham's life was marked by faith that transcended every obstacle, doubt, and fear. The voice of the Almighty promised him a future beyond his wildest imagination. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And through you, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. With these words, Abraham's destiny was sealed. Yet he had no way of knowing how God would fulfill these promises, or if he could even survive the challenges ahead. From the moment of his call, Abraham's journey was not just physical, but deeply spiritual. His obedience would bring him to strange lands, difficult circumstances, and intense trials. But each step forward, marked by unwavering trust in God, would reveal the incredible truth. God keeps his promises, no matter how impossible they may seem. This story, though ancient, remains timeless. It serves as a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever faced uncertainty or doubt. Abraham's life teaches us that even when we are called to leave everything behind, our comfort, our security, our plans, God's plan for us is far greater than anything we could imagine. His faithfulness, even in the face of our doubts, is unwavering. As we walk alongside Abraham through his trials, victories, and heartaches, we are reminded of the truth that God never forsakes his promises. Abraham's legacy, one of obedience, trust, and unwavering faith, offers us a powerful example of how we can respond to God's call, even when the path ahead seems unclear. His story challenges us to step out of our comfort zones, to trust God when the journey ahead is uncertain, and to know that every step we take in faith brings us closer to the fulfillment of God's promises for our lives. Are you ready to walk the same path of faith and trust in God's promises? Abraham's journey is not just his own. It is a story for all of us who seek to live by faith, trusting that the God who called Abraham will lead us as well. As you read through Abraham's story, reflect on the moments in your own life where faith has led you to unexpected places, where God's promise was clearer than the challenges around you. His story is not just a piece of ancient history, it is a living testament to the power of faith, obedience, and God's unwavering commitment to those he calls. Abraham's journey reminds us that even in our deepest trials, God's promises remain true. It's a reminder that the journey of faith is not just about where we are going, but how we trust God along the way. If you're ready to dive deeper into this incredible story, keep reading. Let's walk together through the powerful, life-changing lessons that Abraham's life has to offer. And remember, if Abraham could walk in faith through every challenge, so can you. At the age of 75, Abraham, originally named Abram, received a command that would forever alter the course of his life. The voice that spoke to him was not audible to the ears, but it resonated clearly in his heart, louder than any storm. Leave your homeland and your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. This divine call was not just a request, but a pivotal moment in his life. It was a command to leave everything he had known, his family, his culture, his city, and his comfort. Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous city located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. His father, Terah, was a respected man, but their lives were ordinary, governed by the cycles of nature and the practices of a polytheistic society. Though his father was well regarded, Abraham's life had been far from extraordinary. However, when the voice of God reached him, it marked the beginning of a new and incredible journey. The promise that followed was clear. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And by you, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. These words filled Abraham with awe and confusion. How could someone like him, a mere mortal among many, be chosen for such a destiny? The promise was as overwhelming as the night sky under which he stood. But despite his doubts, Abraham obeyed. He did not question the voice, nor did he seek assurances. Instead, he packed his belongings and set out on the path that had been laid before him, not knowing where it would lead. The decision to leave Ur and follow God's command was not an easy one. It meant abandoning his family, his friends, and the life he had known for decades. It meant leaving behind the safety and prosperity of his city for the uncertainty of an unknown land. But Abraham's obedience was unwavering. He knew that the God who had spoken to him would guide him, even if the journey seemed uncertain. Abraham took with him his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions. They traveled through the region, first stopping in Haran, a city along their path, where they stayed for a time before continuing toward the land of Canaan. It was a long and arduous journey, but through it all, Abraham's faith remained strong. He believed in the promises that God had made to him, even when he could not see the outcome. As they arrived in Canaan, Abraham saw a land rich with promise. The rolling hills and fertile valleys stretched before him, filled with potential. But the land was also inhabited by other peoples, Canaanites, Perizzites, and other tribes who had lived there for centuries. Despite this, God reaffirmed his promise to Abraham, telling him that this land would one day belong to his descendants. In this moment, Abraham recognized that his journey was not just about a physical relocation, but about the fulfillment of God's divine plan for humanity. The promise that Abraham would become the father of a great nation was more than just a personal blessing. It was part of a larger plan, a plan that would eventually bless all the nations of the earth. Abraham's life from this moment onward would be a testament to his faith in God's promises. He was no longer just a man from Ur. He was a man chosen by God to carry out a divine purpose. Each step he took on his journey, whether in times of peace or trials, would be guided by the hand of the Almighty. As he settled in the land of Canaan, Abraham knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. He had obeyed God's call, and the path ahead was still full of uncertainties. But one thing was certain: the God who had called him would be faithful to his promises. And so Abraham's story began, a story of faith, obedience, and a deep relationship with the God who called him to leave everything behind and follow his will. As Abraham and his family journeyed deeper into the land of Canaan, the promise of God continued to resonate in his heart, a promise that was as powerful as the stars in the sky. When they arrived at the place known as Shechem, under the oak of Moreh, Abraham felt the weight of the divine calling more intensely than ever. The land before him, stretching out with its hills and valleys, was both beautiful and unfamiliar. The Canaanites, who had long inhabited this land, looked at him with curiosity and perhaps suspicion. Yet Abraham knew that this was the land God had promised him. It was there under the oak tree that the Lord appeared to Abraham once again. The divine voice confirmed the promise: "To your descendants I will give this land." This declaration was not just a reaffirmation of God's earlier words, but a profound assurance that Abraham's journey had a purpose. It was a message that transcended his current circumstances, a glimpse of a future that would unfold through generations to come. Abraham, in response to this divine encounter, did what any faithful servant of God would do. He built an altar to the Lord. In that moment, Abraham understood that his journey was not just about reaching a physical destination, but about establishing a relationship with God through acts of worship and devotion. The altar he built at Shechem was a symbol of his obedience, a declaration that he was ready to follow God's guidance wherever it would lead. As he moved on from Shechem, Abraham traveled to the hill country east of Bethel, where he set up his camp between Bethel and Ai. Here he once again built an altar to the Lord, calling upon his name. This pattern of worship, of marking each new step with an act of faith, became a cornerstone of Abraham's journey. It was a reminder that his life, his family, and his future were all tied to the promises of God, and that every place he called home was sacred in God's eyes. But even as Abraham embraced the promise of God, life in Canaan was not without its challenges. The land that had been promised to him was not uninhabited or free from difficulties. The Canaanites and Perizzites, who had been living there for generations, posed a challenge to Abraham's possession of the land. Yet Abraham continued to trust in the Lord's words, knowing that God's plan for him was greater than the obstacles in his path. Abraham's faith was further tested when a famine struck the land. The land that had seemed so fertile and full of promise was suddenly barren, leaving Abraham and his family in a difficult situation. As the famine worsened, Abraham made the decision to leave Canaan and seek refuge in Egypt, where the Nile provided abundance and sustenance. This was not an easy choice, for it meant leaving the land God had promised him. But in the face of desperation, Abraham, though obedient to God, still found himself wrestling with doubt. As he left Canaan, Abraham's fear grew, especially regarding the beauty of his wife, Sarai. Knowing that her beauty could draw unwanted attention, he devised a plan to protect himself. He asked Sarai to say that she was his sister, believing that this would allow him to avoid harm. Though this decision was made out of fear for his own safety, it would soon lead to consequences that would test his faith and the trust he placed in God's protection. Upon arriving in Egypt, Sarai's beauty did indeed captivate the Pharaoh's court, and she was taken into Pharaoh's palace. Abraham, although relieved to be spared, could not have anticipated the chain of events that would follow. Because of Sarai's presence in Pharaoh's palace, God intervened, bringing plagues upon the Egyptians. Pharaoh soon realized the truth, that Sarai was not Abraham's sister, but his wife, and confronted Abraham. The tension between truth and deception now loomed over Abraham's journey. In his confrontation with Pharaoh, Abraham was questioned about why he had misled Pharaoh and risked the lives of others. Pharaoh, despite his anger, allowed Abraham and Sarai to leave Egypt, and they returned to Canaan with more possessions than they had left with. This experience left Abraham with a deeper understanding of God's protective power, and he knew that God would continue to guide him, even in moments of weakness. Abraham returned to Bethel, the place where he had first built an altar to the Lord. It was here in this place of sacred memory that Abraham was reminded of the promises God had made to him. He realized that his journey was not just about his own survival or prosperity, but about the fulfillment of a much larger plan, a plan that would shape the destiny of nations. As Abraham continued his journey through the land of Canaan, he found himself facing new challenges. His wealth, which had grown during his time in Egypt, now began to create tensions within his family. Abraham had returned from Egypt with livestock, servants, and possessions. Lot, his nephew, who had accompanied him on the journey, also had substantial wealth in cattle and sheep. The land that had once seemed abundant was now too small to accommodate both of their growing flocks. Strained by competition over pasture land, their herdsmen began to quarrel, creating a division that Abraham knew he had to address before it tore apart the family he had worked so hard to keep together. The land was not only inhabited by Abraham and Lot's flocks, but also by the Canaanites and Perizzites, two peoples who had their own claims to the land. As tensions between Abraham's and Lot's herders continued to grow, Abraham recognized that peace between them could not be achieved through conflict. In his wisdom, Abraham sought a peaceful resolution, understanding that the unity of their family was far more important than the riches they had accumulated. He approached Lot and proposed a solution. "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are brothers. The whole land is before you. Let us part company. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." With these words, Abraham offered Lot the first choice, a sign of humility and generosity. Abraham, despite being the elder and the one who had received the divine promise, did not seek to impose his authority. Instead, he trusted that God would continue to guide him, regardless of where he settled. Lot, seeing the fertile land of the Jordan Valley, decided to choose the land that appeared most prosperous. He looked toward the area around the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were known for their lush pastures and abundant water. The choice seemed logical as the valley was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. However, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were notorious for their wickedness and sin, and Lot's decision to settle near them would soon come to have dire consequences. While Lot moved eastward toward the Jordan Valley, Abraham remained in Canaan, trusting in God's guidance. After Lot's departure, God spoke to Abraham once again, reaffirming the promise he had made earlier. "Lift up your eyes and look from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth." If anyone could count the dust, then your descendants could be counted. This promise was not just about the land itself, but also about the future of Abraham's descendants. God was making it clear that Abraham's obedience would lead to a legacy that would be as enduring as the earth itself. The promise was not conditional on the actions of others, but was rooted in God's divine plan. Abraham responded by traveling throughout the land, from the north to the south, and from the east to the west. He surveyed the land, not out of greed or desire for wealth, but in humble submission to God's command. It was an act of faith, an acknowledgement that the land, like everything in his life, belonged to God, and that Abraham was simply a steward of the blessings God had bestowed upon him. Abraham then settled near the Oak of Mamre in Hebron, where he built another altar to the Lord, marking yet another sacred place on his journey. This act of worship was more than just a ritual. It was a declaration of his trust in God's provision and a recognition of the divine promises that were still unfolding before him. While Abraham found peace in his new home, Lot's decision to settle near Sodom would soon lead to a series of events that would test not only his own faith, but also Abraham's. Sodom and Gomorrah were cities filled with sin, and the time was soon coming when God's judgment would be poured out upon them. Abraham, though far removed from Lot's choice, would soon find himself interceding for his nephew in the city of Sodom, demonstrating the deep bond of family and the compassion that Abraham had for those in need. This chapter of Abraham's journey teaches us valuable lessons about faith, humility, and the importance of making decisions with an eternal perspective. Abraham could have claimed the best land for himself, but instead he trusted that God's plan would unfold regardless of where he settled. His willingness to let Lot choose the land that appeared most prosperous was a powerful act of faith, and it set the stage for the unfolding of God's plan for his descendants. After Lot separated from him, Abraham continued his journey through the land of Canaan. His faith, though strong, was often tested, and yet God had not left him. In fact, the Lord spoke to him again, reaffirming the promises that had been made to him. The land was still his to claim, and God's blessings would continue to flow through him and his descendants. "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look around you," God said to Abraham. "All the land that you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your offspring as numerous as the dust of the earth. If anyone could count the dust, then your descendants could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." Genesis 13:14-17. Abraham was filled with awe as he surveyed the vast land that stretched before him. From the north to the south, east to west, the land was rich and fertile, and God had promised it to him and his descendants. It was a promise that would be fulfilled not just in Abraham's lifetime, but across generations, stretching forward into the future. Yet as Abraham began to walk the land, he understood that the promise was not just about a physical inheritance. It was also about a relationship with God, one that was rooted in trust, obedience, and faith. The promise that God had made to Abraham was an eternal one, and it would be passed down through Abraham's offspring. Even in the midst of challenges, Abraham knew that God's plan for him was unfolding step by step. The next phase of Abraham's journey was marked by both victories and setbacks. As Abraham continued to explore the land, he faced difficulties and struggles, but he always trusted in God's promise to guide him. One of the greatest tests of his faith came when the land experienced a severe famine, which forced him to leave Canaan in search of food and shelter. Abraham's decision to leave Canaan and go to Egypt was a difficult one. He had trusted in God's promise, but now in the face of hunger and uncertainty, he questioned whether he should stay in the land that God had promised to him. The famine in Canaan was severe, and Abraham, fearing for the survival of his family, decided to make the difficult journey to Egypt, where there was food in abundance. However, as they neared Egypt, Abraham's fear grew. He feared that the Egyptians would take notice of his wife Sarai, whose beauty was renowned, and that they might kill him to take her for themselves. In his fear, Abraham asked Sarai to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister, not his wife. This was a half-truth, as Sarai was indeed Abraham's half-sister. But it was a deception that would soon have consequences. When they arrived in Egypt, Sarai's beauty did not go unnoticed. She was taken into Pharaoh's palace, and Abraham was treated well because of her. He received sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels, and servants, But the cost of this favor was high. Pharaoh, unaware that Sarai was married to Abraham, was soon struck with a series of plagues. When Pharaoh discovered the truth, he confronted Abraham, questioning why he had lied and allowed him to take Sarai as his wife. Abraham, realizing the gravity of his actions, was deeply ashamed. He had put his wife's safety at risk and had compromised his integrity out of fear. But despite his mistake, God's protection over Abraham and Sarai remained. Pharaoh, after returning Sarai to Abraham, sent them away with even greater wealth than they had arrived with. Abraham's time in Egypt was a stark reminder that even when we fail or act out of fear, God's promises and protection remain. Although Abraham had made a decision based on fear rather than faith, God was still faithful to his word. This experience deepened Abraham's understanding of God's sovereignty, and he returned to the land of Canaan, confident that God's hand was upon him. Abraham's journey continued, marked by the ongoing tension between trusting in God's promises and facing the realities of life. But even in his moments of doubt, God reaffirmed his faithfulness. Abraham learned that faith was not a static belief, but a living, breathing trust that must be exercised in every moment. And as he walked the land, he knew that God's promises would be fulfilled, not in his time, but in God's perfect timing. It was here in the land of Canaan that Abraham learned one of the most important lessons of his life. Obedience to God is not always easy, but it is always rewarded. Even when the road ahead seemed unclear, and even when fear clouded his judgment, God's plan was still unfolding. Each step of the journey was a step toward the fulfillment of the divine promise, a promise that would change not just Abraham's life, but the lives of generations to come. Abraham's journey continued, and with it, the unfolding of God's grand plan for him and his descendants. While he had seen the promise of land and offspring, there was one crucial aspect of God's covenant that remained unfulfilled: the birth of his heir. Abraham at this point was growing older, and his wife Sarai, who was also advanced in years, had not yet borne him a child. Doubts began to creep into Abraham's heart, and he began to wonder how God's promise would be fulfilled. One evening, as Abraham lay in his tent, uncertain about the future, the Lord spoke to him once again. This time, the Lord took him outside and asked him to look up at the night sky. "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." God said, "So shall your offspring be." Genesis 15:5. Abraham looked at the vast expanse of the sky, filled with countless stars, and in that moment, he realized that God's promises were not just words but a vision far greater than he could comprehend. The Lord then made a covenant with Abraham, one that would be remembered through the ages. "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it." God assured Abraham that his descendants would inherit the land and that he would be with him throughout every step of the journey. The covenant that God made with Abraham was not just a promise of physical land, but a divine bond that would span generations. Abraham believed the Lord, and his faith was counted to him as righteousness. Despite the assurances of the covenant, Abraham still had doubts about the specifics of how God's promises would be fulfilled. He asked God, "How can I know that I will gain possession of this land?" In response, God instructed Abraham to prepare a sacrificial offering, a covenantal ritual that would symbolize the binding agreement between God and Abraham. Abraham gathered the animals as God had instructed, and as the sun began to set, a deep sleep fell over him. During this time, the Lord revealed to Abraham the future of his descendants. He told him that his offspring would be strangers in a land that was not their own, and they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But God also promised that after that time, he would judge the nation that enslaved them, and his people would emerge with great possessions. God reassured Abraham that he would die in peace and be buried in a good old age. However, the full realization of God's promises would not come to pass in his lifetime. As the vision ended, the Lord made a final declaration: "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." Genesis 15:18. The promise of the land was now sealed through a divine covenant, and Abraham's faith in God's plan was further solidified. Though Abraham had believed in the promises of God, the reality of their fulfillment was far from immediate. The covenant that God made with Abraham was not something that would be realized in a short time. Instead, it was a covenant that would require patience, endurance, and faithfulness over generations. Yet despite the long wait, Abraham trusted that God would deliver on his promises. God's covenant with Abraham was a powerful testament to his faithfulness and commitment to his people. It was not a promise that would be forgotten or ignored. Even though Abraham would not live to see the full fruition of God's promises, the covenant was established, and his descendants would be the beneficiaries of God's blessings. For Abraham, this covenant marked a turning point in his relationship with God. It was not just about a promise of land or offspring. It was about the trust and devotion that Abraham had and the God who had called him. Abraham's faith was tested and strengthened by the covenant, and it was this faith that would serve as the foundation for the generations that followed. Though Abraham faced challenges and doubts, he continued to walk in obedience to God's commands. The covenant that God made with him was a reminder of God's unshakable promise and his unwavering faithfulness. For Abraham, it was not just about the land or the descendants. It was about knowing that the God who had called him was with him every step of the way. As Abraham continued on his journey, the covenant with God would continue to shape his life. His faith in God's promises remained steadfast, even as he faced more challenges and tests of faith. The covenant was not just a promise for Abraham's time, but for all generations to come, a testament to God's everlasting faithfulness and his deep love for his people. Years passed, and still the promise of an heir remained unfulfilled. Abraham and Sarai had grown older, and the hope for a child seemed more distant with each passing year. Sarai, who had long been barren, began to lose hope. At 75, Abraham had received God's promise of descendants, but now at 85, the fulfillment of that promise seemed less likely with every year. Sarai, growing impatient and anxious, suggested to Abraham a plan to help bring about the promise. She offered her servant Hagar to Abraham as a wife, thinking that perhaps God's plan would be fulfilled through her. Abraham, feeling the weight of the years and the uncertainty of the future, agreed to Sarai's plan. Hagar became pregnant, and Sarai's heart grew jealous. The situation became strained, and Sarai, feeling the frustration of her own barrenness, confronted Abraham about the situation. Abraham, though initially allowing the arrangement, was not prepared for the emotional fallout that followed. Hagar, now carrying a child, began to look down on Sarai, and the tension between the two women escalated. Sarai, in her anger and frustration, mistreated Hagar, and the servant girl fled into the desert, seeking escape from the harsh treatment. But God, ever faithful to his promises, did not abandon Hagar. He appeared to her by a spring in the desert and asked her to return to Sarai and submit to her authority. God reassured Hagar that the child she was carrying would be the father of a great nation, and he gave the child a name, Ishmael. The promise that Hagar's son would be a great nation was a reminder that even when things seemed impossible or out of control, God's plan was still in motion. Ishmael, though not the promised child, was still part of God's greater plan for Abraham and his descendants. After Hagar's return, Sarai continued to struggle with jealousy and bitterness, and the situation only worsened. But even in the midst of the turmoil, God continued to remind Abraham and Sarai of his promise. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, but the waiting for the birth of the promised son, Isaac, seemed unbearable. The journey of faith had become long and arduous, and yet God's promise remained unchanged. When Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him again, reaffirming his covenant and giving him a new name. "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." Genesis 17:4-5. Abraham was now the father of many nations, and God promised that he would make him exceedingly fruitful. God also told Abraham that Sarai's name would be changed to Sarah, and that she would bear him a son. Abraham, at the age of 99, fell face down on the ground and laughed. He questioned how it was possible that he, a man who was so old, and Sarah, who was 90, could bear a child. Yet God was unwavering in his promise. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" God asked Abraham. "I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Genesis 18:14. Abraham and Sarah, though they laughed at the impossibility of it all, believed in God's promise. In that moment, they understood that the child promised to them would not be born by their own power, but by God's miraculous intervention. It was a reminder that God's plans are not limited by human limitations or natural laws. His promises, no matter how impossible they may seem, will always come to pass in His perfect timing. And so, a year later, at the age of 100, Abraham finally received the son that God had promised him. Sarah, at the age of 90, gave birth to a son, and they named him Isaac, which means laughter. The birth of Isaac was not just a personal joy for Abraham and Sarah, but the fulfillment of a divine promise that had taken years to unfold. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments of doubt, God's timing is always perfect. The birth of Isaac was the beginning of a new chapter in Abraham's life. It was a fulfillment of the promise that God had made to him so many years before. But with this promise came a new test of faith, one that would challenge Abraham's trust in God more than ever before. The birth of Isaac was a moment of great joy for Abraham and Sarah, and it seemed to mark the fulfillment of God's promises. Isaac, the son of laughter, was the long-awaited child who would carry the covenant forward. Abraham and Sarah saw in him the miracle of God's faithfulness, a child born to them when all seemed impossible. Isaac grew, and with him, the hope for a great nation was strengthened. However, just as the joy of Isaac's birth settled into their hearts, a new and unimaginable test of faith awaited Abraham. One day when Isaac was still young, the Lord spoke to Abraham once again. This time the command was one that would test Abraham's faith in a way he could never have anticipated. God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Genesis 22:2. The command was clear, yet incomprehensible. How could God ask Abraham to sacrifice the very son through whom the promises of God were to be fulfilled? How could the same God who had promised to make Abraham's descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky now ask for Isaac's life? Abraham's heart must have broken at the thought of losing his son, the child of promise, but despite the pain, he obeyed. The next morning, without hesitation, Abraham rose early and began his journey to Mount Moriah, taking Isaac, two of his servants, in the wood for the offering. The journey was long and silent. As they approached the mountain, Isaac, still young, noticed that something was missing. "Father," he said, "the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Genesis 22:7. Abraham, with a heart full of anguish, yet resolute in his faith, replied, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Genesis 22:8. Abraham's response was a statement of faith, even in the face of the most painful test of his life. When they arrived at the appointed place, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac, placing him on the altar. As Abraham reached out to take the knife and sacrifice his son, a voice from heaven stopped him. "Abraham! Abraham!" Genesis 22:11. It was the angel of the Lord who called him by name. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22:12. At that moment, Abraham's faith was proven. He had trusted God completely, even in the most incomprehensible of circumstances. God had not intended for Isaac's life to be taken, but rather he had sought to test Abraham's faith and obedience. And in that moment, Abraham's faith had been fully realized. God, who had always been faithful to his promises, had provided a way for Isaac's life to be spared. As Abraham looked up, he saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. It was a miraculous provision from God, the lamb that would be offered in place of Isaac. Abraham took the ram, sacrificed it as a burnt offering, and named the place, "The Lord Will Provide." Genesis 22:14. This name became a powerful testimony to Abraham's faith and God's faithfulness. It was a declaration that God had provided what was needed at the right time, and that Abraham's faith in God had been tested and found true. After this event, the angel of the Lord spoke to Abraham once again, reaffirming the promises that God had made to him. "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Genesis 22:17-18. This reaffirmation of the promise was not only a blessing for Abraham, but also a reminder that obedience to God, even when it requires great sacrifice, is always rewarded. Abraham's obedience in offering Isaac was the culmination of a lifelong journey of faith. It was the ultimate test of his trust in God, and it revealed the depth of his devotion. Through this act of faith, Abraham demonstrated that his loyalty to God was greater than his love for his son. And because of this, God promised to bless Abraham abundantly, and his descendants would inherit the land and become a great nation. This moment in Abraham's life marks a turning point in his faith journey. It was a moment of deep sorrow and overwhelming trust. But through the sacrifice of Isaac, God showed Abraham, and all who would follow his story, that obedience to God's will, even in the face of the greatest trials, brings the fulfillment of his promises. Abraham's life had been one of trials, promises, and unwavering faith. From the moment God called him out of Ur, he had been on a journey that would change not only his life, but the course of history. His obedience to God's call, his patience in waiting for the promised heir, and his willingness to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac demonstrated the depth of his trust in the Almighty. But Abraham's journey did not end with the sacrifice of Isaac. He continued to live faithfully, marking each chapter of his life with acts of obedience and worship to the God who had called him. Through all the tests, challenges, and victories, Abraham's faith was the unshakable foundation upon which the promises of God were built. His life became a testament to future generations of what it meant to trust in God's promises, even when the road ahead was unclear. After the dramatic test on Mount Moriah, Abraham's life continued. Isaac, the child of promise, grew, and with him came the fulfillment of God's covenant. Abraham knew that Isaac would be the one through whom God's promises to him would be realized. It was Isaac who would carry on the legacy of faith, and it was Isaac's descendants who would inherit the land that God had promised to Abraham. When Abraham was 175 years old, his time on earth came to an end. He died in peace, satisfied with the life he had lived. As he passed away, he was reunited with his ancestors, leaving behind a legacy of faith, obedience, and God's faithfulness. His death marked the end of his earthly journey, but the promises God made to him lived on in the lives of his descendants. Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, both played significant roles in the continuing story of God's covenant. Isaac, the child of promise, received the full inheritance of the covenant, and through him the nation of Israel would be born. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, though not the chosen one to carry the covenant, was still blessed by God and became the father of a great nation. God had promised Abraham that both of his sons would be the fathers of many nations, and this promise was fulfilled as their descendants spread across the earth. Abraham's legacy also lived on in the land of Canaan. The land that had been promised to him and his descendants was eventually inherited by his grandson, Jacob, who would later be renamed Israel. Jacob became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation that would carry forward the covenant made with Abraham. The promise of a great nation was not just a distant hope, but a reality that began to unfold through the generations. After Abraham's death, Isaac took his place as the patriarch of the family, and he continued the journey that his father had started. God reaffirmed his covenant with Isaac, promising to bless him and his descendants. The God of Abraham became the God of Isaac, and the covenant passed from one generation to the next. Isaac's faith, like his father's, would be tested, but the legacy of Abraham's trust in God would continue to shape the future of Israel. Abraham's story is one of profound significance. It is the story of a man who was willing to trust God with everything, even his own son. It is the story of a man who was called to leave everything behind and follow God's will, no matter the cost. It is the story of a man who believed in God's promises, even when they seemed impossible. And it is the story of a man whose faith was rewarded with blessings that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The legacy of Abraham is not just a legacy of faith for Israel, but for all people. Through Abraham's obedience, the blessings of God were extended to the nations of the earth. The promise that all nations would be blessed through Abraham was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. the ultimate descendant of Abraham, through whom salvation would come to all who believe. Abraham's journey was a journey of faith, obedience, and trust in the promises of God. His life was a testimony to the truth that God's promises are always fulfilled, even when they seem delayed or impossible. Abraham's legacy continues to inspire and challenge us today, reminding us that, like him, we are called to live by faith, trust in God's promises, and pass on that faith to the generations that follow. As we reflect on Abraham's life, we are reminded that our own journey of faith may be filled with challenges, doubts, and tests. But like Abraham, we are called to trust in God's promises, knowing that He will fulfill them in His perfect timing. The story of Abraham teaches us that, though the road may be long and difficult, God's faithfulness never fails, and His promises will always come to pass. The story of Abraham is a powerful narrative of faith, obedience, and divine promises. As we walk through his life, from the call to leave his homeland to the final years of his life, we are reminded that faith is not always an easy journey. Abraham's path was filled with challenges, doubts, and moments of fear. Yet through it all, he remained steadfast in his belief that God's promises would be fulfilled, no matter the obstacles. One of the most profound lessons from Abraham's life is that faith often requires us to take steps into the unknown, to trust in God's plan even when we cannot see the full picture. When God first called Abraham to leave his home and go to a land he had never seen, he didn't have all the answers. He didn't know where he was going or how long the journey would take, but he trusted God. Abraham's faith wasn't based on certainty or logic. It was based on the trust that the God who called him would lead him through every difficulty. This is something we can relate to in our own lives. Just as Abraham was asked to leave everything behind, we too are often called to step out of our comfort zones and trust God with our lives. It could be a new job, a relationship, a move to a new place, or a decision that doesn't make sense in the moment. Like Abraham, we may not always know the outcome, but we are called to trust God, knowing that He is with us every step of the way. Another powerful lesson from Abraham's journey is that God's promises are not always fulfilled on our timeline. When God first promised Abraham that he would become the father of a great nation, Abraham was 75 years old. Yet it wasn't until many years later, when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, that their son Isaac was born. For many years, Abraham had to wait, trusting that God's timing was perfect, even when the promise seemed impossible. Waiting is often the hardest part of faith. It requires patience, endurance, and trust in God's perfect timing. Like Abraham, we may face periods in our lives when it feels like God's promises are delayed, when our prayers seem unanswered, and when the road ahead is unclear. But Abraham's story shows us that God's delays are not denials. His timing is always right, and His promises will always be fulfilled, even if it takes longer than we expect. Abraham's faith was also tested in ways that we can hardly imagine. When God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, the very son through whom the promises would be fulfilled, Abraham's trust in God was put to the ultimate test. In that moment, Abraham did not hesitate. He was willing to give up everything, even the child he had waited for decades to have, because he trusted that God's plan was greater than his own. This moment of obedience is a testament to Abraham's faith and trust in God. It shows us that true faith requires surrender. It requires us to let go of our own desires and plans and trust that God's ways are better. Just as God provided a ram in place of Isaac, He will always provide what we need when we are faithful to His call. Finally, Abraham's story is a reminder that our faith is not just for our benefit. God's promises to Abraham were not just for him, they were for the generations to come. Through Abraham's obedience and faith, the blessings of God were passed down to his descendants. The promise that all nations would be blessed through Abraham was ultimately fulfilled through Jesus Christ, the ultimate descendant of Abraham, who brought salvation to the world. In our own lives, our faith can have a ripple effect that extends far beyond us. The choices we make today can impact our families, our communities, and even future generations. Our obedience to God's call can be a source of blessing to those around us. Like Abraham, we are called to live in such a way that our faith impacts others, pointing them to the goodness and faithfulness of God. As we reflect on Abraham's life, we are encouraged to trust in God's promises, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. Like Abraham, we are called to live by faith, knowing that God's plans are greater than our own. And even when we face trials and challenges, we can take comfort in the fact that God is faithful and His promises will always be fulfilled. Abraham's story is not just a story from the past. It is a living testimony of the faithfulness of God. It encourages us to walk by faith, to trust in His timing, and to know that no matter where the journey takes us, we are never alone. God's promises are sure, and He will always provide for those who trust in Him,